So I thought we'd start kind of just with an opening question that might allow you all a little bit of insight into what their books are about. If you haven't had a chance to pick them up, you can do so right after this. But I'd love to know, just to start off, is there a moment that brought you kind of incredible clarity around where your book was going, right? Was there an interview or something that was just like a moment where all of a sudden you like saw your way through the fog, or for Sam, for you, where you were actually in the moment, where you realized kind of what was going to be very important looking back and telling this story?
I can start, yeah. So I was in 08 and 09, I'd been on Wall Street for like 7 years, and the crash was happening, and it was obviously a crazy time on Wall Street, and Lehman Brothers was going down, and Bear Stearns, and the whole world was shaking. Our hedge fund was actually in a decent position, so we weren't losing money, but it was a scary time for everybody, and everybody around me was terrified. And I had sort of been going through this process where I was starting to question a lot about what I was doing and where I was sort of standing in the world, and the crash really exacerbated that. And so I remember being in a meeting with my billionaire boss, who was one of the smartest guys I'd ever met, and it was, we were, and several other traders were in the room, and we were talking about the hedge fund regulations that were being proposed by Congress. And everybody in the room thought they were a terrible idea, but I was starting to think that they made sense. And so I said so, and I said, well, wouldn't this be better for the system as a whole? And it was this terrible moment where it was like the music had been turned off, and my boss leaned across the table and shot me this withering glare and said, Sam, I don't have the brain capacity to think about the system as a whole. I can only think about what's good for us in our business. And, candidly, it wasn't so much, I did judge him, but I also recognized him, and I recognized myself in him, and saw that for me, my whole life, my book is really about ambition and my relationship with my dad, but my whole life had been about, clawing to the top and getting this money and getting this prestige and getting this business card. And I think in that moment, I sort of came to understand that there was something off about that, and that I also didn't want that. That for the first time, that sort of ambition seemed to be no longer worth it.
I'd say, for me, I had read, McDonald's wasn't helping me with this book, nor was Joan Kroc's family. And most of Ray's family wasn't helping me at that point either. So I was sort of left to my own devices. And I'd found an item, a tiny 1-inch item in old newspapers, 1971, saying that Joan had filed for divorce from Ray. They didn't even name her. They just said the wife of the McDonald's CEO has filed for divorce, citing violent, ungovernable temper. And Joan hadn't married Ray till 1969. They'd had a long affair on and off, and other spouses involved before they finally married. And so I was curious to find out more about this, and I had to call the Cook County Courthouse to get the divorce records. And it was quite a trial to do that. It took a while. Finally, the papers arrived after I plunked down the necessary cash for copying, and I sat on the floor of our home office in downtown LA, voraciously reading these, legal papers from many years ago, and I found out the details of the divorce from Joan, that Joan was alleging from Ray, against Ray, and hearing it, reading it in my mind, and hearing and imagining her going through this, because it was quite a painful situation. I realized I'd known that Joan had started an alcoholism education charity with Ray's money when she wasn't able to get Ray help. And that was interesting too, but knowing that moment on the floor in my office, that the depth of their despair and their problem really made me realize I had to keep going and tell her story, because how she transcended that was so incredible and graceful.
So I took 8 years or maybe more to write my book. It began when I went to Africa with Bill Clinton to write a profile of him for Esquire magazine, 2005. And one of the things that happened there on that trip was I got to see the beginning of the HIV/AIDS program that he had started, which was to bring medicine to people suffering from AIDS in Africa and elsewhere in the world, where it was thought that it was unaffordable to provide them with drugs. And basically that was the Western world saying, we're going to let tens of millions of people die. Clinton said no, he and Nelson Mandela. And he had started this little program. It started out small in Africa, and this was in 2005. It had been underway for a couple of years. We went to the island of Zanzibar, which is off the coast of Tanzania. It's a magical place, but a lot of people there were suffering from AIDS, and they were kind of hidden because it's a Muslim country, and there was a lot of stigma attached to it then. And I met some families there who were getting relief, medicine and other support from Clinton's organization, including some small children who were there with their parents or their mothers. 8 years later, we went back to Zanzibar in 2013. I went back to Zanzibar with Clinton, and we went to the same organization that had brought these patients to Clinton's group in the first place, an organization of families with HIV or AIDS who had banded together basically to protect themselves against the rest of the society. Now it had grown, it was respected, it was out in the open, it had hundreds of members, they were all getting medication and other support, and there was a young man there, a teenager I guess, who had a sign that he held up when Clinton came in, and it had a picture of a little child on it, and that was him. And I had met that boy 8 years earlier when he was little child who had HIV and probably would have died along with his mother, and they were both alive, and he came up to Clinton, and I saw Clinton greet him and begin to weep, and that's when I knew that was the core of the book. It didn't help me shape the book, but I knew this was what was essential to the story of that people I think didn't know about what he had done and what it was about. So